good to be here in this capacity and working with the Continuing Ed and the Church in the 21st Century Center. The topic for this evening, mentoring relationships in ministry with youth and young adults, is one that I've been working on for the last few years. And I'm coming to see it as more and more important, the concept of mentoring. So I'm going to spend tonight talking about why and then how. And as I speak about it, my primary concern is the context of religious congregations. Okay? So if you are coming from another setting, the university setting or somewhere else, you might be able to kind of make some translations for yourself. But as I'm speaking about it, that's going to be my primary concern. And I thought maybe the primary concern of the people attending this evening. The first question is, why would you bother mentoring? And my point with this is to kind of pay attention to how, as humans, we interact with one another. And one of the first things that's noted is that when we're dealing with small children, we usually create a lot of safety around them and guidance. And we expect that as much to be the case. You say, they don't know so much, they're young, they're going to get hurt, I got to make the world a safer place. And so we do that. We allow them, in this instance I'm using the image here of the tricycle, we allow them some parameters in which they can function, but we're supportive of what they need to get done, and we also create a safe place for them to do it. Okay? We don't send them off into heavy traffic early on. But the reality is that when adolescents reach adolescence, we're increasingly allowing them to live in a world that's much more complex and dangerous without nearly the supports that they're going to need to function in that world. Okay? So we give them less guidance than they need. And I'll talk about reasons for why that happens. Okay? And then when they move into young adulthood, they get even less guidance than they need, and they're living in a highly competitive world. And as I'm saying here, we hope that they'll survive the crash and burn, but we seldom intervene in any way that's supportive or directing or even just shares in the experience. Okay? Because of the way our society works, because of the presumptions that we have about the population. What I'm proposing tonight, and I'm doing in other places, is that we very intentionally bring together generations to mutually support and challenge so that these people, the adolescents and young adults, can grow and thrive into mature adulthood. Okay? It's not an easy task. And with fewer and fewer supports that are automatically around youth or young adults, it's a much more challenging task for them to do. My other part of that hope is that it will be mutually beneficial, that those who are doing the mentoring, however that may express itself, in fact benefit from the relationship as much but differently as those who are being mentored. Right? Well, let's look first at the teen and young adult years. This is a very long process of change. But it is change. I think one of the underlying themes in this span of years, and we can talk from like 13 to 33, we're looking at a span of increasing change and maturity that's going on for a lot of different reasons. Okay? But in that process of change, there's kind of a primary focus, or there's multiple foci here, that in this long trajectory, a person is coming to know who they are, so their sense of identity, what they're going to do and contribute to the world, right? And where they fit, and how they fit, and with whom do they fit. These are kind of the primary tasks of moving from childhood into adulthood, is figuring out who am I, where am I going to contribute, and where am I going to fit. Sharon Parks talks about it as learning to feel at home in the world. Okay? And it's an interesting image that she uses, because very much in a sense, you have children and adolescents leaving home only to find their home. But that home that they find is not the same place that they have left. And the home that they find is a home that they have a great deal to do with making it themselves. Okay? So for children, their home is given to them, and the process of adolescence and young adulthood is moving out of that home and finding a home that fits for them. Okay? That is not an easy job. Okay? It's a long process, and it's a process that's gotten longer over the last century. But in that process, one of the things that's going on is that they're learning to see more. And they're learning to make new sense of the more that they see. Those two pieces are extremely important. That you don't make sense until you actually have something that makes sense out of. And you don't make sense until you need to. And when you start moving into adolescence, your ability to see more of the world is dramatically changed. And then the need to make a new sense out of that is essential to the process. It's also at this time that a person is only beginning to grasp the concepts of long-term cause and effect. It's not simply immediate tit for tat, but being able to think long-term, plan out a trajectory. They're also only beginning to see connections and motives. They're not simply seeing actions, they're beginning to see behind the actions as to what may have motivated that action. They're beginning to recognize that in themselves, and they're beginning to extrapolate that and make some sense in that in other people. Okay? That's a level of complexity that you don't have as a child, but you do begin to have in adolescence. And part of this whole thing is the ability to think abstractly, okay? And make complex meaning out of things. So what's going on here is a very dramatic shift in a person's ability to engage in the world and make sense out of it, and then also be more responsible for it and to it. And as I'm saying here, these are only introduced in early adolescence. And it will take through early adolescence, all the way through adolescence and into young adulthood before these processes that are introduced early on are fully on board. And a person can really do something with them. It's not quite like riding a bike, but it is a little like riding a bike, in that these capacities need practice to be mastered. And if you think about riding a bike, generally we start with tricycles. Then we might go to our first two-wheeler with training wheels. But then it takes a while before we actually take those training wheels off. And then it takes a while longer before we get actually a really full-size bike. Okay? Now think about it. When we recognize physical developmental changes, we put the parameters around, we create the safety nets, we put on the training wheels. But what I'm describing in all of that list of things are things that are in fact cognitive capacities that tie into physical changes and emotional capacities. And these are much more difficult to grasp than physical changes. David Elkind, who's one of his books is out here on the table, talks about probably the biggest challenge that adolescents have is actually dealing with their new brain and their new capacity to think. Okay? And so that's where all this comes from. What's happening, we can look and say someone's gotten taller, they've gotten broader, they're developing parts of their body they didn't develop so much before. Okay? But what we don't see, and it's probably the biggest shift that's happening in the person, is the development of the brain. Recent brain research has shown that the brain is developing, that there's a new growth spurt that happens in pre-adolescence, particularly to the prefrontal cortex, and that's that image that's up there, the pink part of the brain. There's a whole growth spurt that's happening there. And other parts of the brain are growing in greater synchronicity. Okay? So what that means is that with the development of the prefrontal cortex, which is considered the CEO of the brain, the executive functioning of the brain, the person is only just beginning to gain new capacities to think abstractly, see long-term cause and effect, to ideate. Okay? Before that time, the child is actually depending less and less on that part of the brain. They're depending more and more on a part of the brain that's at the center. You see it there in the purple coloring on the slide. That part of the brain is more the emotional or gut center of the brain, where we respond to things, we understand things, and respond to things emotionally. Okay? So it's interesting. When you look at children and at early adolescence, the primary place of their computing ideas or reactions to things is actually from an emotional center in the brain. And it takes through adolescence for them to begin to shift that processing center from an emotional space to a more reasoning space. Okay? Now, we don't see this happening. You know, it's not like we suddenly realize, oh, we got to buy them a new pair of pants because they're growing taller. But this dramatic change that's happening inside the brain is having serious consequences for how they interact with the world. Okay? And it's practice. It's like a brain on training wheels. Okay? The people, because you look older, because you in some ways want to be older, people increasingly nowadays treat you as automatically as if you are, and give you responsibilities for things that they never would have given responsibility to a smaller child. Okay? But the reality is that emotionally and cognitively, you're probably not ready. Okay? But you need to be brought to readiness. Okay? And we need to help people in that process. There's an idea in brain research that talks about use it or lose it. That the brain, because it's gone through a growth spurt, has new capacities. But also through the process from early adolescence into young adulthood, the brain is actually being pruned. Okay, so areas of the brain that are being used get strengthened, and the areas of the brain that are not being used and tasks that are not being tried are pruned away. Okay? And the brain is getting more highly organized in its functioning through these years. Okay? What this means is that adolescence and young adulthood are times of tremendous opportunity for growth in the way the person thinks and engages with the world. It's tremendous opportunity for their capacity to pay attention to their emotions and use them in new ways. Instead of being subject to them, they now can understand them and work with them. Okay? But this is a process that's going to take years to master. Okay? They're not, and the thing is, you're not there automatically. Just because you have the raw material, it doesn't mean that raw material is ready for mature use. So I say it's going to take through adolescence and into adulthood. Okay? It is in this time that you're only beginning to learn to think about consequences. Okay? Adolescents are not very good at thinking about consequences, as this little illustration from Zitz demonstrates. Okay? I don't know if you can read that very clearly. But it's only in adolescence that you're beginning to think about consequences, and it's really a sign of maturity in adulthood that a person takes responsibility for the consequences of their life. And many young adults will say that's a marker for them of being an adult, is that they're then responsible for the consequences of their decisions. Okay? So do you see, even that's an incremental change. Recognizing consequences and then taking responsibility for them is a developmental shift. It's a growth. Okay? So here you have these persons with their growing brains, their growing capacities to understand what's going on out in the world, the growing understanding of how they interact with it, their new ability to kind of see their emotions and take some responsibility for them, see their actions, take some responsibility for them, see other people, make new sense of them. Those are all new and wonderful things. But contemporary adolescents and young adults are having now to deal with extraordinarily complex problems. And this is just looking at the North American setting. Okay. One of the things that's very true, especially you see like here at Boston College, where you have highly successful young adults who are received into this school, you see very high expectations today in adolescents and young adults for material success. It's a very high expectation. In large part, it may be because parents have paid a great deal of money and they want to make sure there's a return on that investment. But it's understood by the adolescent and the young adult as a lot is expected of me, and I need to get a good job, and I need to succeed, and I need to be secure. And if you ask them, why do you need this? It's usually because this is what they have been told they need. Okay? So the expectation is coming from outside of them, and they're internalizing it. Okay? One of the other pieces that is that's a part of that is that as a nation we have had over the last century an constantly increasing standard of living for people. And the presumption then that every generation will in fact do better than the one before them. Now that makes it considering where we are now as a nation, economically and otherwise, that trajectory has been questioned and things are either flattening out and some people are experiencing that they in fact are not doing as well as their parents did. Okay? But the expectation is still there that they will. So the pressure is that much higher. It's not like they can just ride the current of the social change, as may have been the case for generations before them. Okay? So the cost of that high expectation for material success is significant. Another thing that's a part of contemporary life is the constant marketplace pressure to buy commodities, but not only to buy commodities, but to begin to commodify themselves. That they are themselves somehow things that are sold, and that they have to work very hard to make themselves sellable to other people. Okay? There's all sorts of stuff that could be unpacked in that, but let me just give an example of it that you would see, and that is the creation of images on Facebook or MySpace, where people are constructing something that they hope will be attractive to other people. Right? There's a sense of, to some degree, there's a sense of commodification about the person's very self in the way that that's being attended to. All right? Another, and I'm just, as you see, brushing surfaces on huge issues here. Another constant reality is that they live in a highly sexualized world and that their social interactions are highly sexualized. Okay? Such that you have preteen children who think and who dress and behave in a highly sexualized manner, and you say, what's that all about? We might think it's cute, but the reality is that they're reflecting a world where marketing is highly sexualized. So you have young girls playing with dolls that are, we look at them and say, can you believe the dolls that they're playing with? Can you believe the images that they're trying to copy here? This is just kind of the air that they're breathing, and it's part of the world that they're in. Right? In that, social interactions are also highly sexualized. You know, if you ask at a place like Boston College, is there dating on this campus? The answer is no, not really. If you ask instead, is there hooking up, which means some kind of sexual encounter between two people, they say yes all the time. The entryway, the understood entryway for social interactions between sexes is generally through sexual interaction and not through social relating otherwise. It's a very unusual phenomenon, but it's one that's part of the normal for today. So that's a part of the world, that's a way of being in the world that was not here just a generation ago or even half a generation ago. Okay? And underlying all of those pieces, and those are only just a handful of things that fit on one slide in terms of complex problems that are being dealt with today, underneath all of these is a very high expectation of their own maturity and independence. Okay? Somebody beeping? Okay. Is it me? Within all of this, they expect, and we expect of them, that they're going to be able to handle this all on their own. And that is a very tall order. Okay? Add to that, well, this is a kind of part of the complexity of the fabric, the realities of modern transportation and technology, that today we get to interact with more people than we ever could before in human history. Right? There's also a high expectation that once you've met somebody, you'll never cut off contact with them. You'll Facebook them, you'll friend them, you'll whatever, text, tweet, whatever. You're going to keep in touch with them in their every move. It's a reality that never existed before in human history, but now we kind of expect it in the North American context to be normal. You will constantly keep contact with all the people you've ever met. And by joining into social networking organizations, you'll also find people you wanted to forget. You know, your whole high school class is suddenly before your eyes, and you said, I thought I left them behind. Now, they can find you now. And there's an expectation in that finding that there's going to be some kind of mutual exchange. I'll leave it at that. But in that, there's actually less time for meaningful interactions with the people closest to us. So it becomes a leveling of the playing field. I tweet everybody. This is what I'm doing. Right now I'm giving a talk here at BC. All right? But I don't then have the time to actually spend real time with the real people who are really important to me. Okay? Now, as mature adults, you might say, "Yeah, but I know how to function, how to do that. I know how to. These are the acquaintances, and these are the real friends, and these are the companions I've made serious commitments to." But when you're just growing up in this world where everybody's a friend, you don't. You still have to navigate. Well, what's the difference then in relationships? Okay. So, in that multiplying of relationships, in less time for meaningful interactions with those closest to us, we have a greater sense of isolation amidst a constant barrage of connection. Okay? And navigating that is a challenge. And there is frequently then less opportunity to go deep with any of these. Okay? Have I made it bad enough yet? Yeah. If we look at the daily life of teens, you have to recognize that in early 21st century, most teens spend their day with age peers. Right? And either through school or now increasingly social networking. And most adults in their world are paid to be there. Teachers, coaches, therapists, whomever. Okay? In that, teens then increasingly look to one another for guidance. Now, they've always looked to their friends for guidance, but they're looking less to adults because adults are in their frame of reference less. Okay? Chap Clark, whose book Hurts, I recommended they put out front there because I thought it was a really valuable book. He did a big qualitative study a few years ago and wrote this book out of this. And this is a man who had a great deal of experience working with youth. And he was, in his work with youth, he was getting more and more concerned with normal youth. He's saying there seems to be a disconnect that's going on now that I've never found in all the years I've been working with youth. And so he wanted to study why, so he did. He initiated a big study. And his focus was not at-risk youth or high-achieving youth, but normal, the big normal in the middle, to say what's going on with them. What he found was that these youth who are reading that world that we mentioned a moment ago, that they spend most of their time with their age peers and otherwise everybody else in their world is paid to be there, their read of it, their interpretation of this was that they felt that they had been abandoned to raise themselves. Their parents had sent them off to other people to take care of them, paid employees. Okay? Now you put that in front of parents, they're aghast. Like, no, I just want what's best for my kids. I want to give them the great opportunities. I want to make sure they're safe. All of that may be true. The reality is, from the teen's perspective, which is limited, they're seeing it as them being shuffled aside to be raised by other people. Okay? And in that, they're saying, well, then I must really be responsible for raising myself. Okay? So their presumption is that they should be going it alone. This is teenagers. Teenagers' presumption is that they should be going it alone. But what Clark found was that while they thought they were supposed to go it alone, their deepest desire was for help and connection with adults. But they didn't know how to do it. But that was their deepest desire. But they don't know how to ask, they don't know who to ask, and that's a problem. Okay? Young adults, it's a little bit different, but not necessarily that much different. They're still spending a great deal of their time with their age peers. If they're on a college campus, it might be the first time that they're beginning to engage with adults as peers because the adults are treating them that way, and they're drawing them forward. Okay? So there might be a wide network of support for them that they're beginning to say, hey, but this is a place that I'm welcome. This is a place that they want me, and they're really treating me as somebody who has something to bring to the table. But these same networks that may be present on a college or university campus are not, by and large, present outside that setting. So for the young adult who's on a college campus, they're not finding the same things at their home parish. They're not finding the same things just outside that setting. And for those who aren't on a college campus, which is a huge number of people, of course, who are young adults who are working, they're not finding these anywhere. Bottom line is that these people, too, need help. Right? But again, don't necessarily know where to find it or that anybody is interested to give it to them. Sharon Parks names some of the challenges of dealing with issues that are too big too soon. Yeah. In her book, Big Questions, Worthy Dreams, she names them as this. First of all, that they have unreliable internal emotional supports. It's not that they don't have an internal emotional life, but it's not always reliable yet. Right? Again, this is part of the growth process. Right? And so they can still be very swayed by the emotions that are going on and not be very reasonable about things, which can get them into trouble. She also sees that they have, because of their primary focus is their own life, and they're only just beginning to look beyond themselves, she said that they kind of glorify the limited personal experience. You know, what's good for me is what's good, right? Okay. Right. And they're going to be looking for more immediate advantages because they're only beginning to really test out long-term cause and effect. So this thinking, it's what feels good right now for me, and so that must be what's good. And it's a good answer. But she also sees in that the stress that comes with thinking they should be able to answer these questions on their own, and at the same time knowing inside they can't. Right? So again, high sense of expectations coming from outside of themselves that then get internalized, fighting with their own sense of, I have no idea what I'm doing, but I better look like I do, because everybody's expecting me to. Right? Tough situation. All of this, I'd say, is in the framework of a social isolation, which I'm calling the new normal. We think that it's normal to be isolated. Because what I'm saying with both these adolescents and young adults is that they live with a sense of isolation from other people, particularly those older than themselves. In the good old days, if they were good. Just start by saying humans are social. We need each other. Okay? And until very recent history, we lived within networks of support that were organic. Whether we were agrarian or nomadic, we lived, our nuclear families were within extended families, and those extended families were within expansive communities that were geographically stable for the most part. Okay, there were patterns of being together and behaving. Connections of care in that setting were organic. Okay? And in that setting, then, parenting was shared by everybody. Now, granted, I'm a ways away from a nomadic lifestyle, but even in my growing up, and I can imagine for many of you here in the room, you may have grown up in settings that were relatively stable, neighborhoods and such, where people knew each other for a while, and so everybody parented everybody. And you just behaved yourself out on the street because somebody you don't even know would call you by name and say, I'm going to tell your mother. and you knew that that was real. And so you straightened up. And that constant sense of supervision helped not only you grow up, but it also helped your parents parent. Okay? That reality is less and less the case for a number of reasons. Now I would say that families function more as islands. They do their own little thing. It's in the way we structure our communities, physically structure them. It's in the way we build our houses. You know, we might think the attached two-car garage is a wonderful thing because we don't have to get wet when we go to the car. But the downside is that we never see our neighbors. You know, we never have occasion to run into them. The high mobility of our society means that if I'm raising a family, it's very likely I'm raising it not where I grew up or my extended family is, unless I grew up in a metropolitan area. Okay? But the expectation was we get up and we move. And that is a relatively recent phenomenon. And what it means is that the organic networks of support that used to be part of the human community are not there anymore. Okay? What it also means is that parents actually carry more of the burden of parenting, which didn't used to be the case. Yeah? I'm one of 9 children, as was mentioned at the beginning. My parents didn't raise me alone. There were a bunch of other families in that neighborhood, and my grandmother was in the neighborhood. I was responsible to everybody, just because that's the way it worked. Okay? And my parents were in communication with these other families and the other parents just about issues around parenting. So it was a shared sense of values that they talked about on some occasions. And so they could count on one another. And they had a sense of safety about sending us around the neighborhood or even quite distant, because they thought this is a community that's going to care for people. And that's in a city of 50,000 people. It's not like we were in a town of a couple hundred families. Okay? But what I would suggest, because a lot of when I talk about mentoring and reaching out to teens, people will say, well, parents won't let you. I would suggest that a reason behind parents not letting anymore has more to do with their own sense of insecurity around their parenting job than anything else. Because now they're doing the job alone that used to be carried by lots of people. But they're still getting the message that the most important job they do is raise their kids. And the last thing they want to be seen is deficient at the most important job that they do. And so it makes the job really a competitive one. Not that they're saying, I'm going to be the world's best parent and but as soon as somebody makes a critique, there's no way, that parent doesn't have around them the supports to let them say, yeah, it was a bad day, you know. Parents don't let other parents have a bad day very often. So I would suggest to you the parents that are most oppositional to getting help are the ones who are feeling most beleaguered and most insecure about their ability to do that job. A job that in human history parents never did alone until now. And boy, is it a hard job, and to do it alone is horrific. But it only makes it bad for everybody. Okay. This going it alone message is a message of the culture. But overcoming this isolation is something we really, really need. But when you talk about mentoring and trying to create communities, you're going to have to expect opposition. Because people have already internalized the idea, I'm supposed to do this alone. I'm not supposed to need any help. So you're going to get that both from adolescents and from young adults and from parents, even when what they'd really like to be saying is, holy smokes, I'm so glad someone's going to help me, because it's the hardest job I've ever done, just living as a human being in the world and helping other people. But it's part of the world that we live in. Let me just take a moment then and just let you think for yourselves. Is anything that I've just said reflected in the reality that you know? Or am I blowing smoke? Do you recognize these realities in the teens and young adults that you know, in the lives of families? Just take a moment and think about that. And since I've talked for long enough right now, let's just take a minute, turn to somebody else and tell them what you've seen. Let's just take a moment to do that. Okay. So, I'm suggesting that what we need to very more intentionally do is connect with community. Because all of us need it. We all need to feel welcome. We are human persons that are social animals. We need to be in community with other people. But it's harder to be in community now than it ever had been before, because of the social isolation that we're experiencing and the greater effort it takes to move your way into community. Okay? Because it's usually that. You have to go find your way into a community, because seldom is a community coming out to meet you. Right? Most communities, particularly church communities, particularly Catholic church communities in New England, presume that people will find their way in. We presume that everybody knows what we got, they'll just come when they're ready. And the reality is, it's gotten to the point where people don't know what we got. So how can we expect them to find their way into a community when they don't know that there's anything of value to be had in that community? Right? And as I'm saying here, teens and young adults look to their age peers, but their age peers are not necessarily good guides on mature decision making. But that's who they look to almost exclusively. Right? And that's problematic. Oops, sorry. Christian Smith, who did a major survey, it's actually still underway, of American teens and religion and spirituality, published a book in 2005 called Soul Searching, and this year he's published a second book called Souls in Transition. And he's looking at the lives of American teens and now young adults relative to religion and spirituality. One of his findings in the book is that he reports in the book is that American youth who are religiously active are healthier in all indicators than non-religiously active peers, regardless of their socioeconomic status. Healthier on all indicators. Okay? There's a lot of reasons for that, but big reason for it is actually being part of a community that finds meaning in life. And so you're supported by it and directed in it. As well, he said that youth connected with more than one adult congregant did better than those who weren't. Okay? So it's not just their parents, and their parents are highly influential in this regard, but also other adults in the congregation who recognized them, talked to them, just noted that they were there, and welcomed that. He's not alone in that finding. Sharon Parks, in her book Big Questions, Worthy Dreams, who's looking at older, Clark was looking at adolescents in his first study. Sharon Parks is looking at young adults. And she is seeing that the value of mixing older adults with young adults is gaining a perspective over time and space. Remember, she was the one saying that young adults use some pretty limited markers to make decisions. She said being in conversation with older adults gives them perspective on their views and decisions. Okay? That gives them a greater scope, a broadened scope of meaning making. Problem is that both of them are seeing is that that's not happening enough. On top of that, a religious faith offers a framework of meaning. For the major questions that a young person is addressing at this point in their life, a religious faith offers a framework for working those out. So the questions of identity, who I am, what I contribute to the world, and where I fit and with whom, get addressed in a religious faith setting. Okay? In the Christian tradition, we would speak of all of these things within the context of discipleship. Okay? To be able to make sense of all three of these major questions. But that does not mean that there's an automatic answer. Okay? And that's what's important. It's not saying if you join a religious community, automatically we'll have these answers made for you. In fact, I would say that's not a very helpful religious community, if that is what they're doing. And some of them are. But a good, healthy religious community should be one that says, let us help you make some sense of these big questions of your life. What are you going to do with your life? Who are you going to be? Who are you going to be with? Right? Because in the Christian tradition, under the concept of discipleship, it's a way of seeing yourself in relationship with God, seeing yourself in relationship with the wider world, okay? And finding one's place in it. And it offers a wider framework of meaning. It's not just about the here and the now. And it's not just about you. It's about the world. It's about the reign of God. So the framework can be expanded beyond the individual in meaningful ways. Not that it automatically gives answers, but it gives a way of addressing the questions. Right? And as Sharon Parks would say just in the title of her book, it's a way of asking big questions and thinking worthy dreams. Expand the possibilities for people. And it also offers a community, both a present community that is diverse and a historic community that's even more diverse because it's going through the ages. Okay? That both supports and challenges the individual. Okay? And it offers religious practices that shape people in that vision. Okay? So religious communities actually offer a lot that would help both adolescents and young adults figure out their lives. Not that it gives them answers, but it gives them a place to make those questions and a framework by which to make those questions. So could it be that faith communities could be companions on this journey? What's interesting is that the U.S. Bishops' document, Renewing the Vision, which is their document that they wrote, I think it's 97, on youth ministry, they call the church today to become the traveling companions of young people. And they use the story from Emmaus as the image. So in the story of Emmaus in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus is walking with two disciples, listening to their story and then sharing his own understanding of the story. And that in that conversation and in that meeting and the breaking of the bread, they saw everything new again. Okay? So the bishops are suggesting, couldn't the church be a place of companioning? Not directing, not showing, but walking with, journeying with. Okay? Again, let me ask you to stop for a moment and think for yourself, because I think this is an essential question. How does your religious faith help you to make sense of the concerns of your adult life? And what value does that faith community add to your life? Charge you to think about that, because if you don't know what's valuable in it, you're going to have a hard time convincing anybody else that they ought to find anything of value. Think about that for yourself. Presume, because you showed at a place called Theology and Ministry, a school of theology and ministry, it might be a value. But what? Think for a moment for yourselves. What is of value to you? Now, I'm going to ask you the next question. Why would I ask you this question? Because teens and young adults today having to deal with adult concerns without being fully on board with all the adult capacities and simply life experience to deal with those concerns well. Right? So we don't need to give adolescents and young adults infantile understandings of the faith. What we need to equip them with is mature understandings of the faith that help them deal with the mature problems they're faced with. Right? So I ask you, the next question is, what of value would you give to somebody you cared about? What would you give that would help them meet that task? All right, we're going to stop for another moment. Turn to the friend you just made. And just, of all of those 3 questions I put out there, just maybe share a thought. So what I'm suggesting is that we intentionally plan on spending time as adults with people who are younger than ourselves. Parks offers these 4 points about what makes a person a mentor. And she says mentors can happen informally or formally. And sometimes we get thrown off by the term, particularly because the business world's been using it in very formal ways in the last number of years. They team up a younger colleague with an older colleague. And whether the relationship works or not is beside the point. What we're looking for is a relationship where these kinds of things happen, whether it is done formally or informally. But these are her 4 markers. One is that there's recognition, that the mentor sees in the individual something that they don't necessarily value in themselves. They recognize something. They say, wow, that's really great what you can do. Now, notice, parents can do that, and the kid doesn't hear it or value it. But when somebody who's not their parent does it, they'll come home and say, Mrs. Smith told me that I am a great artist. And my parents are like, I've been doing that for the last 4 years, but you didn't hear me. But now that somebody who's not supposed to love them says something nice, it suddenly gets a response that could never possibly happen out of a family setting. Okay? The second piece is support. A mentor offers support. They not only say, hey, you know what, I can see that you're a great artist. You should connect with my friend so-and-so who would love to see your work. So mentors can offer networking, they can offer advice, guidance. If you're going to pursue this, you might consider talking to this person, or I would go to that event, or I would do this, or did you ever think about? So mentors are not only recognizing something in another person, they're offering avenues and helping along with those avenues. A third thing is that they challenge the person to think that the gift that they're given isn't just for them, but it is actually for the common good. You weren't given these things just so you could enjoy them. You were given these because the world needs what you have to offer. Oh, wow. Really? And then fourth, inspiration. Very often mentors put things in a larger frame of reference. That their life is about something more. That they're here not only to give something because others want it, but because the world needs it. In fact, for the reign of God to go forward, their gifts are essential to the venture. Right? So these four elements together, some in greater degree than others, are what makes a mentor a mentor. That's what makes it really click. Now, of course, it's also a matter of just relating well with people and having a relationship. But if you think for yourself, in your own life, who were those people for you? Or were they out there? Okay. Again, it probably wasn't a formal relationship, but you can probably think of people who were mentors in your life, who saw something in you, who helped you out, who challenged you to more, and who said, this is about something big. Right? What did they offer you? And how did they draw you out to see yourself differently? Right? And what's also a good question behind this is, what were the circumstances under which you met? Or that you got to know one another? I would suggest to you, I'm not going to ask you for the answer to this question, but I would suggest that on that third one, what were the circumstances under which you met? For many of you, it was a rather informal connection that you may have made in a more formal structure. Right? That circumstances put you together, and in those circumstances, you just connected with somebody. And then that relationship developed. The circumstances were such that they got to know a little bit about you, enough about you that they either approached you or you approached them. Okay? And then from there things went forward. That is very often how mentoring relationships that are just simply the more informal kind happen. They allow for formal settings. Formal settings are set up that allow the informal connections to happen. Okay? The ones where you're more formally designing it can, in fact, backfire because you're stuck with somebody who you wouldn't have chosen. But to design a setting whereby people just get to know each other and meet, then those connections will happen because that's just the way humans work. They seek each other out once they've got an idea who they like, who they're interested in, what's going, and how they might meet. So if we think of congregations as companions or as mentoring communities, which is another thing that Sharon Parks talks about, we might begin to think of how this would look. One of the things to keep in mind, and this is really not a small thing, that churches or religious congregations are one of the last places in U.S. society where generations mix regularly. And they're not paid to be there. So you might look at a school and say, in a school, but there's a whole lot more adolescents than there are adults. And guess what? All the adults in the building, except maybe a couple of exceptions, are paid to be there, and the kids know it. In a congregation, there might be a handful of people actually paid to be there, but the majority of the congregation is adults, and they're not paid to be there. They choose to be there because they want to be there. This is a rare thing in North American culture. It just doesn't happen anymore in that kind of way. Some people might say, but what about at a soccer game for kids? The parents are there because they're supporting the kids. They're not there for themselves. Okay? They wouldn't show up at soccer if they didn't have a kid. People show up at church even if they don't have children. I don't know if you know that, but it's true. Okay. The thing is, we don't capitalize on this. And this is something we can. We have a setting already there where generations are mixing, but then the service is over, everybody heads home. What can we do in this congregation? By the way, that's my home church in the picture. I needed a picture of a church. I thought, well, which one? Oh, mine. But if you're thinking programmatically, if you are a minister, a director of religious education, you're somehow responsible for leadership in a congregation, you may say, how would I go about this? If you're on a religious education board in a parish, if you have parish council, whatever you might be, you say, how would I go about doing this? One of the things I would say is, first of all, don't just think parents, which is what people always automatically do. I'd suggest you think to the larger adult community, because the majority of the adult community in a parish don't currently have young kids in, whether it's religious education programs or whatever. The majority of the adult congregants may be either single, their children may be beyond school age, whatever, okay? And that's a huge body of wisdom, right? Parents are always being called in on stuff for the sake of their kids. But the rest of the adult community is seldom called in. And that's an unfortunate thing for both parts, for both parties, both the younger people and for the older people. And also to think not in new programs necessarily, but in new ways of being together. And I'd repeat again my little mantra, mentoring cannot be forced, but opportunities can be created where relationships develop. So what do? I would suggest that if you're in a congregation, or even in some other setting, you first figure out, what are we already doing? What do we do here normally? Who's already in the mix? And how do they mix now? Okay? So if you looked at something like your liturgy people, your people who assist in liturgical life, who's already there? How can we intentionally bring them together so that the generations mix? You might say, this is a great parish because we regularly have a youth mass where the youth do all the stuff. Great, that's a nice thing. How about better? We regularly have masses in this community, strangely enough, and we intentionally mix together teams that are both adults and younger people, and that they do training together and they are scheduled together. And then they get to know each other. And by getting to know each other, they probably eventually talk about stuff. Right? It's always easier for people to have a conversation when there's a mutual project at hand. That's just the way humans work. You give us something to do, and then we'll do something. We'll talk about what we're doing, and then we'll also talk about, so how's school? You playing soccer this year, whatever. But you might think about, the question I have there is, how could they be regularly brought together for interaction around some project or practice? Right? And the one that I like the best is service projects, which a lot of parishes like to do, but they think, well, we'll send the kids off to do service. Well, what that teaches the kids is that real adults don't do this stuff. Okay, that's one lesson you don't want to be teaching. So the second thought is, why don't we send a few adults off with these people? No, that's not much better either, because I've been at the other end of those service projects, and you see kids kind of skulking around in groups saying, I don't know what we're supposed to do. They just sent us here. Instead, send as many adults as you do kids, and mix them and say, you two do that, and you two do that, and you two do that, and next thing you know, they might be talking about something intelligent, or even half intelligent. Getting to know each other, right? Why do you need to think this way? Because, for two reasons. One, teens assume that adults don't know them, see them, or care about them. And adults assume that this is some foreign body that they just hope they somehow grow out of. And people talk that way. They say, well, someone will say, oh, I have 15-year-olds. Oh, great. Don't you want to send them away till they're like 22? And that's a cultural message, that this is a body of people we don't want to deal with. We don't know how to deal with them. We don't know what to say. And that can very often be true when we say groups have to talk to groups. Well, generally groups don't know how to talk to groups anyway. But if you pair people together, send them off, just like Jesus sent people off 2 by 2, go do this, They will get to know each other. The barriers of unfamiliarity and strangeness will dissipate, and they'll begin to talk across that boundary. And maybe then a relationship will develop. And then that person will begin to recognize them when they show up at other things. And as they get regularly paired together for things, like let's say as liturgical ministers, they just get to know each other, care about each other, tell each other stories about things. This can also be done in educational settings. And I would challenge you to say that when people are reaching adolescence, they need to actually be challenged with more adult ways of thinking and engaging. And so then to be in the presence of adults in the thinking and engaging, while adults are also thinking and engaging, would be very helpful for the development of adolescents in both their faith life, but also their thinking about faith. Because they'd be seeing adults trying to think about faith. Right? But those are the first places that you look. But it's going to be really challenging work because adults are not automatically good at this. They are themselves self-conscious and shy and figure that they're not welcome in the lives of teens and young adults. Right? So they actually need an invitation to intrude. I know I do. And to help in that, I think if you're really going to work this, give them a vision of the effort. Why are we doing this? Just very much like I'm doing with you tonight, is to get them to see this is a need. These kids need you. These young adults need you. Because for adults to participate in it well, they need to see that they're in fact needed. What's simply needed is their presence and companionship. Can you just come and be here and just talk, be friendly, and then we'll see where things go. But what I would also suggest is that if you really want to work this well, is that adult mentors need formal settings themselves. You need to create settings that they have a reason to interact with people who are younger than themselves, so that then the more informal interactions can happen. Okay? They're not going to go up and tap a kid on a shoulder and say, hey, tell me about yourself, and have both of them think that's fine. Okay. But what else do mentors need? They need mutual support, and I would suggest supervision. You might be a little scared, in fact, by the people who said, I'd really love to do this. And you're like, I don't really love to have you doing it. We do need to keep track of how people are impacting one another's lives. And for the sense of parent safety, and of course parents are always scared about what's happening to their kids, we need to have a sense that, we're keeping tabs on everybody. We're keeping tabs on this process. And the adult who's participating needs to know they're not going off the rails. Who's going to help? I don't know. I got this kind of question from a kid. What do I do with this? They need to feel that they've got a place to go to talk about the stuff that they may be seeing. Okay? But I would also say that adult mentors need an opportunity themselves to talk about big issues that they deal with, so that when they turn to somebody younger to themselves, they've actually already had practice articulating their thinking. Because adults seldom have an opportunity in a religious context to talk about how they deal with marketplace pressures, how they deal with their vocation and their sense of meaning in their work, how they deal with relationships and sexuality. They just don't get a chance to talk about this stuff. And sometimes the first time they get a chance to talk about it is when somebody younger than themselves saying, tell me how to do it. And they're like, I haven't a clue. I haven't a clue. I don't know how to talk to you. I don't have the language for it. I need practice talking about this stuff. I have found, though, that when you give adults the opportunity to practice talking about these topics among themselves, they're feeling much more comfortable and confident when somebody younger than themselves turns to them and says, so, tell me about yourself. What do you think about this? And they say, actually, this is what I think. Now that I've had a chance to talk about it with my peers, I feel more comfortable talking to you. But what happens is very often we just throw adults into the teen pool and say, survive. And it's a mess. It can be ugly. All right. What is my hope then for the youth and the young adults? My hope is that because we live in a world that's dramatically isolated, we need ways to break down that isolation. We need to do it intentionally, because the isolation we've taken now is normal, and it's not healthy. So we have to break into the lives of adolescents and youth who are glad to have us break in. and give them access to adults who've just been living longer, thinking longer, dealing with these issues with just a greater capacity, cognitive capacity, emotional capacity, because they've lived longer. But also connect them with a faith tradition that's basically seen all the questions they have to face, in one way or the other. Okay? By giving them access to both of these things, my hope is that both of these things, the tradition and the community that lives that tradition, will be tools to help them understand themselves and their place in the world. Okay? And how they can contribute to it. My worry is that if we don't do that, they're going to have a very hard time functioning. The other hope is for the congregation. To see the younger members as real contributors now. Not the church of the future, whatever we want to say, but part of who we are right now, and as contributors now with the energy, the enthusiasm, the vision for life that they have now. And the belief that that perspective, their perspective that they bring, will add value to the life of the congregation. It will add wisdom. It'll add a vision that we lose simply because we age. Yeah? Paraphrasing the verse from Joel, my hope is that your old will see visions and your young will dream dreams. You know? To do that together, we don't access those dreams and don't share with them our visions. We're not doing anyone any service. But this may be in a time of life when it's actually most difficult, because they appear at first resistant to this process. But I would suggest to you that this is the best time. They're finally coming to a level of capacity that allows them to engage as an adult in a very complex world, and they need help doing it. They can't do it automatically. They need help growing into it. Right. Well, that's it. So, thank you.